Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to cover how to take a collared shirt, including a button down, and transform it into a Mandarin collar, like I have on right now. I want to show you what it looks like. So what's happened is the top of the collar has come off, and I'm left with just the collar stand, and it makes a very nice finish. So dress shirts have two parts to their collars. They have a collar stand right here, and then they have the top of the collar. And they're built separately. They're two different items sewn on. What we're going to do is go ahead and take off this collar part, as I mentioned before. So why would you want to do that? Why is it worth the trouble to do that? Well, for one thing, it's a lot cooler in the summer. I've chosen this shirt because it's a linen shirt, and I'd like to be able to wear it. And in the summer, it takes away one layer that's around your neck, which is one of the ways to keep cooler. It's also just a different look if you want to have something that looks a little different than a collared shirt. So it's easy to do on any of the Paganoonoo patterns. The first step is to remove the collar itself, the upper part of the collar. So if you start with a seam ripper, you can see the top stitching. Oops. I picked a little thread there that I wasn't supposed to. And it should start to feel like it's separating right now. When I pull on it, I can see that there's a second layer of stitching underneath here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that as well. And then I've got the collar truly pulled away from the collar stand. So you can see I've got an opening right here. And I can continue to pick. I think it's a little easier to do when you can pull it apart and you can get it from the inside rather than doing it from the top. And there I have the collar out. So you continue all the way around doing that under there. So we'll come back when I've got the whole thing undone. Basically, you're just picking off that top stitching and pulling out the collar. At this point, I've removed the top of the collar and I have just the collar stand left. People used to turn collars when the tips got frayed. So if you did want to turn a collar instead of making a Mandarin collar, you would just flip it over and use the back side. Now I can see on this one that there's some staining, so you'd want to get rid of that first, but you could flip it over and do that. So I'm going to set this aside. It could be saved to make a double collar later. And then I want to show you what we're left with. It's opened up, which is fantastic, and we have all these little threads along here. So a tool, if you've never used it, that's really handy in the sewing room is a little pair of tweezers, just like the kind you use on your eyebrows. And I'll show you how much of a difference it makes picking this stuff out, because we really want to get rid of all that and not accidentally sew it in. And I think you can see that. So I'll come back when I have all of that tweezed out. So I picked off most of the extra threads, and we have the opening for the collar band all the way around. What I want to do now is pin it together so that the edges are lined perfectly with each other, because we're going to top stitch around, and if they're not aligned perfectly, it's not going to look right. There were 2 rows of stitching when we were originally looking at it, which means that stitching was done on the inside before it was flipped over and top stitched. We're going to skip one set of stitching by having this perfectly aligned and doing the top stitch about 1/8 of an inch away. We shouldn't need to repeat the original step, which would mean we would have to take the whole collar stand off. So I'm getting it nicely aligned, which isn't really very difficult to do. Really critical at the edge. So when I was finishing, it looks like there's a bump right here where there's extra on one side. I'm just going to pull it so it's even on that side and move any excess fabric in towards the middle and distribute it so that it doesn't show at all. And if I pull it tight right here, it looks pretty good. So we have the whole thing pinned and ready to go for stitching. If I look at it, there's a little bump right here I can stick my finger in, so I'm going to scooch some of that over. See if there's any place else, and there is some right along here. So I'm just going to move that. It'll even out during stitching, but just to be cautious. When we come back, we're going to sew it together. I've pulled the stitching out all the way just right to the corner, and that's where I'm going to start. It's very important that you have both threads pulled through the machine. If you start with the bottom thread down by the bobbin, it's likely to bunch up. So you really want it pulled back so you're not ending up with bunching on the other side, which we know shows when you have the collar open. So I'm going to start right on that very tip. And rather than try and knot it or do any other kind of securing, I'm going to go to the tiniest stitch I possibly can, which is basically like sewing in place. Oops. To anchor it, and then go up to a longer stitch. For top stitching, I generally use about a 3 on there, so it may not move forward with the feed dog because it's a little thicker right here. If it doesn't, try to be cautious. Nope, it's moving, but if it doesn't, you can do a gentle tug when the needle's not down to bring it forward. I'm going to go very carefully around that rounded edge. And in fact, I'm going to reposition the needle. If you were really concerned that you weren't getting it just right, you could hand stitch around just that part of it and then start the machine again. Okay. Beautiful stitch. You see me pulling on here. I'm not pulling hard enough to pull the fabric back to make the needle bend. That's really important. You're just really guiding the fabric. I'm going to go all the way around and show you what it looks like from the top and why we didn't need to do that second row of stitching on the inside. I notice I'm starting to build up a little bubble of fabric moving things this way, so I have a couple choices. One is to try to ease it out by holding the fabric up curved as I go. The other is to stop right here, and that's what I'm going to choose to do, and then start from the other side and meet in the back. That way, if there is any kind of problem, it's not right on the very front. So again, I'm going to go to a really tiny stitch, and I'm going to take the needle out and make sure that I keep both threads so that it doesn't bunch up when I start again. And we can see on this side where I started, here are the 2 threads, it's very clean. And we know that it's anchored because I did that small stitch. So I can actually flip to the other side, and I just realized to get my needle around, I'm going to have to remove this button and stitch it back on again. So I'm going to start sewing on the other side, exactly as I did last time, making sure that I have the 2 tails out so that I'm able to start right on the corner. I'm actually going to lower my needle where I want it to be, lower my presser foot, and then put it up to a really, really tight stitch. So it's basically sewing in place and locking in my thread. Doesn't need to be knotted. I don't need to do any back stitching because I don't really want to back stitch right here. I'm going to go down to a wider thread and start my top stitching again. And if I feel like I want extra control, I'm just going to walk my wheel around, which I think I'm going to do for a minute, so I can get the curve very nicely. Yeah, that looks good. Okay, it's looking pretty darn good. And I still have that bubble to deal with. So I am going to redistribute this just a bit before I get any further and push it towards the middle. I'm also going to use that precaution of holding the fabric up curved as I'm feeding it in. Hoping I can avoid having a bubble altogether. And it looks like it's a little bit there, so let me see if I can just spread it out. Try not to have anything land at the back. Put it at a smaller stitch. And I did end up with a crease there. Darn it. So, couple choices. I could try and ease it out with my fingernails. It's actually not too bad. Probably after pressing, it's not going to show. I also didn't match up the stitching to exactly the same width in the back, so if you're a perfectionist, you'd want to rip it out and start over again. So they meet exactly. It looks like my thread size got small too fast. If you're not a perfectionist, it's perfect. So at that point, all we really need to do is press it and clip the threads, and we're done. So let's see what it's going to look like. You're going to want to sew the button back on. But look at that, we have a nice Mandarin collar, and you would never know the shirt was made any other way, and it's clean on the inside. But that's how simple it is to make a Mandarin collar. Thank you.